Hello everyone, my name is Charles and this is a video. I've been playing World of Warcraft on and off for about 15 years now, and Final Fantasy XIV for a little over a year. I know there have been a bunch of these videos uploaded over the last couple of years, but I want to make one on my own, both to practice my editing and to get my thoughts out about the two games in a somewhat constructive way. Will I be saying anything in this video that hasn't already been said in various videos of the same kind? Mint biscuits. There we go. That hasn't already been said. I'll be breaking this video down into various points of comparison between the two games on subjects that I have some experience with both with. For example, I used to be very into the roleplay scene in World of Warcraft, but I won't be talking about that here as I have no experience with it in Final Fantasy XIV, and therefore can't comment on it here. On the other end, I've been thoroughly enjoying the new PvP game mode in Final Fantasy XIV, but I've barely touched the PvP in WoW, and therefore couldn't make a fair comparison. I'll also be starting each point with my thoughts on WoW and then with Final Fantasy XIV, since I played WoW first. It's also worth noting that I'm writing this script and making this video before Dragonflight is released, and I know basically nothing about it, as I want to go into the expansion knowing as little as possible. Lastly, with regards to certain aspects of Final Fantasy XIV, I'll be remaining intentionally vague so as not to spoil anything for anyone who hasn't completed the MSQ. People who have will probably get what I'm talking about, and people who haven't will just have to bear with me on those parts. That all makes sense? Good. Let's begin. Story. The story of World of Warcraft is disappointing. To me, at least. That's not to say it's terrible. If you focus on the old parts of the game before, say, Warlords of Draenor, the story is actually really good for the most part. There are some interesting characters like Varian and Thrall. Some of the quests can contain funny little side stories and tangents, and the far back-reaching lore involving the Titans, Argus and the Well of Eternity is something I've always found incredibly interesting. There is, however, a problem with all that older lore, and it's something that's still very pervasive in the story today. A great deal of it is straight up just not in the game in any good way. Want to know the story of Varian? Get reading. Want to know the story of Arthas? Play a much older and separate game. Want to understand how Illidan became how he is now? Damn dude, better do your research. You could of course just watch a bunch of novel videos, which are all excellent and explain the lore in a lot of depth, but it's kind of annoying to have to do that to understand what the hell is going on with the characters I'm seeing and interacting with in the game that I'm trying to play right now. And I'm aware that the whole game isn't like that. Not by a long shot. In fact, some of my favourite questing experiences in my time playing WoW were when I was first playing BFA shortly after launch. There was a fair bit I didn't know about the history of Kul Tiras, and that didn't seem very important at all, seeing as a lot of the quests had a lot of context and explanations as to what was going on at that point in the time of the nation. In particular, I thoroughly enjoyed questing through Drustvar. The witchy themes, the spooky enemies, and, in my opinion, really great story involving Lucille Waycrest and her family, culminating in a sort of haunted mansion dungeon was something I'll always remember fondly, and I didn't have to know anything coming into that. The story has, unfortunately, taken a dive in recent years. After a few ups and downs over the years, Shadowlands left the story in a bit of a tailspin with the, quite frankly, terrible writing. The jailer being a terrible Thanos knockoff was bad enough, but I still can't believe they killed off Margrave Crexus so soon. Maldraxxus was the zone that I was most excited about going into Shadowlands, and it honestly felt to me like it didn't get nearly as much of a focus as the others. I'm not the only one who feels that the story of WoW has gotten stale and lazy, but something I've noticed is that Steve Danusa gets a lot of the blame for the current state of the game. My question is, does he really deserve that? Does he really deserve to be hated on so much, seeing as he's just one person in a team of writers? Probably. Moving on. The story of Final Fantasy XIV is, in a word, excellent. It's by no means perfect, however. A great example of that lack of perfection is the story of A Realm Reborn. ARR is fine. Some people crap on it, and some people defend it to the hilt. My experience with it is that it was just okay. However, Heavensward and Onward feels like a totally different game in terms of the story quality. Heavensward is like anime Game of Thrones but with less titties. Stormblood is like anime Game of Thrones again, but with more dummy mommy stepping on you. And Shadowbringers and Endwalker are just truly incredible feats of character development and storytelling. Ishikawa, we all thank you. Something I love about FF14 is that you don't have to put a ton of homework in to understand what's going on, like you do with a lot of WoW. The story is all there, in the game. Most of the important stuff is in the MSQ, and there's a whole lot of interesting side content that you don't even have to touch if you don't want to. Something FF14 does super well regarding that point specifically is changing cutscenes and dialogue based on what parts of the game you have done on that character. For example, and in my first bit of vagueness, the cutscene in Endwalker, where you and the Scions receive a special delivery. That scene has so many little bits added onto it based on how much of the side content you completed, it's insane. Before I finished the 6.0 MSQ, I hadn't gone through the 4 Lords quest in Stormblood, and therefore didn't see the references to those during that cutscene, until a while later when I rewatched that cutscene after completing the side story. Rather than burden the player with out-of-context information about characters and happenings you weren't a part of, the game leaves those parts out so you can either explore them in your own time, or just not have to worry about them at all. Also, the characters in this game are so incredibly well written. Alphino is a personal favourite of mine. Seeing him progress and develop from being a spoiled little lordling in ARR to being a stalwart companion as the story continues is a real treat. My absolute favourite character in the whole game, however, is the Shadowbringer's ghost pal. Again, sorry for being vague here. His story and development from when we first saw him to the end of the 5.0 MSQ was something truly spectacular. When his voice lines were used in Endwalker, I fully broke down in tears. Granted, it was at the end of a 3-day binge of the Endwalker MSQ with my best friend, and we were both already emotionally wrecked by that point. But those voice lines fully broke me and her as we both walked to the end. Gameplay. WoW gameplay is great. It's easy to pick up and understand, with a lot of depth for certain classes and specs as you continue into the later levels. Everything from the movement to the combat to the animations are all incredibly satisfying and fun to interact with. The classes are all quite easy to pick up and learn as you go, with more abilities and talents being added as you level up, just slipping into place with the rest. And the good thing about the talents is the flexibility they offer. Yes, there is always going to be an optimal way to set out your talent points. However, that doesn't mean you can't take a different option if the optimal one is making your experience less fun for you. An example I think of is when I used to main Frost Mage in Legion. At the time, the optimal way to play was to talent into Glacial Spike. Use Frostbolt to build up 5 icicles and then spend them with that ability as your finisher. I personally hated the way this played. It always seemed super clunky to me and interrupted the flow of an otherwise very smooth playing spec. So instead I opted for Thermal Void, as it felt far more natural to me to make the most out of my instant cast Iceland spell, powering it up and keeping mobile as I did so. The flexibility of gameplay offered by WoW in the talent trees is really very impressive. Each class usually having 3 separate specs to play, sometimes only slightly different, but sometimes quite drastically different. It allows you to engage with 3 different types of gameplay, apart from Druid and Demon Hunter, on the same character. Of course the gameplay isn't perfect, but I think anyone can see that WoW does a few things here better than FF14 does. Final Fantasy XIV gameplay is, to be honest, a bit jarring to get used to after playing WoW for so long. There are of course a few less important changes, such as the hang time and the jumps with slight wind up with the run speed, but those things are very small and become unnoticeable quite quickly after starting. The main thing that a lot of people seem to have issue with, myself included at the start of my journey into Eorzea, is the 2.5 second GCD. As the game progresses and you level up your character more, you stop noticing this completely. There are plenty of OGCD abilities to fill in the gaps between your GCD ones, and if anything, the game begins to feel somewhat like a rhythm game or a fighting game, as you remember the order of buttons to press and at what times. This is actually spoken about in much more detail by Matt on the Bellular channel, so watch that instead because he does a much better job than I. However, the early gameplay experience purely in terms of ability usage can be a little off-putting. Never is this felt more than when you've been playing the game for a while and you decide to start leveling a new job. I unlocked and started playing Lancer a few days ago, and good lord does it feel slow compared to Monk or Samurai. I understand those jobs are both quite button heavy, but pretty much all jobs are at that level in some respect, and going from endgame to starting over really doesn't feel great at all. However, once you start to gain a few levels and get more into the flow of your chosen job, it's excellent. The rewards are absolutely worth the time you put in to get there. I mentioned Monk and Samurai a moment ago, and the reason for that is because I only recently leveled both of them to 90 after having them both sat around 70 for quite a while. They both feel truly incredible to play, so smooth and fluid, the animations are satisfying, the effects are wonderful to watch play out, and it's absurdly fun to build up your standard combos and pop off on your moments of glory and use your big cooldowns. My personal favourite abilities of the 2 jobs are Ogi Namikiri for the Samurai and Phantom Rush for the Monk. One is simply linked to a big cooldown and the other requires some setup, a classic case of build and spend to use. In conclusion here, Final Fantasy XIV gameplay starts off a bit sluggish and clunky, but once you finally feel it click at some point, nothing beats it. Music. The music in World of Warcraft is largely pretty great. The vast majority of it is purely ambient in nature, not something you'd necessarily jam out to, but definitely something nice to have on in the background while you work through your tasks. which I guess was always the exact purpose of it. A personal favourite of mine is the Elwyn Forest theme. This music is pure nostalgia for me. It never fails to make me feel relaxed and even almost at home. I have many fond memories of levelling in Goldshot with my brother back in the late days of Burning Crusade, early days of Wrath. Just messing around, doing quests, figuring out how the game worked, with our dad sat behind us watching us play. To be purely objective, it's pretty fine. I think if I heard the music for the first time today with no prior context, I wouldn't really care much for it. But as a matter of personal opinion, I think it's wonderful. However, I think somewhere the music falls off a bit is with dungeons and raids. Not to say the music is bad or anything, it just starts to suffer from its previous strength of being purely ambient. Off the top of my head, I legitimately cannot think of any dungeon or raid themes. They're all so forgettable and take far too much of a backseat to the gameplay in my opinion. The music in Final Fantasy XIV, to put it simply, is excellent. Not every track in the game is a banger, but the ones that are truly bang so hard. Many of the ambient themes are pretty nice. The city themes in particular are amazing. My personal favourites of those are Ishgard, Kugane and Old Sharlayan. I could, and have done, sit in those cities for hours on end AFK, just to listen to their day and night themes on loop. And something that Final Fantasy XIV really blows WoW out of the water with is the boss fight music. Some of my favourites include Escape from the Omega fight, Rise from the Alexander fight, In the Balance from the Null Thal fight, and Flow from Masayoshi Soken is the main composer for the game. He does such a truly incredible job with every piece of music he writes. I'm sure many people know this story, but one of the best songs he wrote for an MSQ boss in Shadowbringers postgame, he wrote while in the hospital battling cancer. It sounds cliche, but you can really feel the passion he puts into his craft, and they turn boss fights from a fun mechanical challenges into unforgettable experiences. Graphics and design. The graphics in WoW are really very nice. There are of course a lot of older things that haven't been updated, but I genuinely wouldn't want them to be anyway. I'll use Elwyn Forest as an example again. The lower polycount environments and buildings there have a certain charm to them that I can't quite place my finger on. Probably something to do with nostalgia again, but there's just something pleasant about them that makes playing in that area a joy. On the other hand, we of course have all the newer places to travel. The art team at Blizzard do an absolutely brilliant job. On one end you have a place like Borealis, with its seaweed-strewn architecture and nautical-themed details and inhabitants. And on the other end, you travel across the realms of death to the beautiful druidic paradise of Ardenweald, all tinged with dark blue and purple hues, with unusual flora and fauna dotting the land. I feel that it's rare that a game can be so consistently great with graphics and design over the many years it's been running, but WoW somehow manages to pull it off. There are obviously a few duds in the mix. As much as I like Tanaris from a nostalgic perspective, the design of a vast open desert with very little going on is quite boring, and the handful of dragonic bones scattered across it don't quite do enough to completely interest me. And of course the characters and gear are largely fantastic. I'm not a huge fan of how massively furry the designs of some of the races and characters are. In fact, it's actually quite a big downside in my eyes. But they do at least look nice from a graphics perspective. The WoW gear isn't always the best, but the better items are so good they've practically become iconic even outside of the game itself, such as with the Paladin Tier 2 armor and Crown of Domination. What is this? The graphics and design of FF14 are largely great, but can be a little disappointing at times. This is especially noticeable in the ARR zones and gear. It kind of hits the opposite end of the spectrum of WoW's early stuff. Where that still had a certain charm to it, the early FF stuff just looks a bit rough and unpolished, and even a bit boring. It's not horrible by any means, it's just not my cup of tea. However, it improves a whole lot from Heavensward onwards. The zones seem to have more fleshed out detail, making it a pleasure to explore them for the ether currents rather than a chore. I'm personally a huge fan of many of the zones in Othard. They're fun to run around in and explore, and as I said before, I just enjoy sitting in Kugane and relaxing sometimes, partly because of the beautiful appearance of the place. The character design is mostly very nice, and I honestly don't have a great deal to say about it. The characters are aesthetically pleasing. My only wish is for a few more customization options. I like playing a big chunky cool Tyrann in WoW. Let me play a chunker, Squeenix. Much of the same said about the zones can be said for the gear. The ARR gear is largely a little dull. There are a few nice pieces here and there, and the job gear you get at the end of the story of ARR is really nice, but too much of it is just recolours of the same drab items. On the one hand, this does give you the vibe of being a fledgling adventurer who can't afford or hasn't defeated the enemies necessary to get nice gear, but it feels to me like it lasts too long before you actually start getting the nice stuff. However, once again, in Heavensward and onward, this really improves. The newer gear pieces and weapons added are mostly very nice, and even the occasional recolor isn't unappreciated if they look nice enough, and aside from the eyesores that are the ultimate weapons, the vast majority of the weapons in the game look nice and will fit with some kind of aesthetic. Community. I feel like I might make some people mad with this point. As far as I'm aware, this is one of the biggest points of contention between the two games, and something many people take very seriously, and will let rule their decision of which game they go to. However, as I've said, this video is my opinion, so I'm just going to say what my experiences have been. The World of Warcraft community is largely pretty bad. I've been playing the game since about halfway through TBC, and only taken small breaks here and there. I've had some great experiences with the community over that time. My first guild back in Wrath were a largely very nice bunch of people who were incredibly patient with me and my brother as we were still learning the game, and I'll always have fond memories of them. As the years went on, however, the community seemed to change, to me at least, and this was in no way helped whatsoever when in WoD I decided to move to an RP server just for something to do, seeing as the game itself was boring the hell out of me. I really think that if you want to have a good time playing WoW with a focus on the people you play with rather than the game itself, you need to get lucky and find a nice guild that matches with your interests. Solo play is truly unpleasant to have to deal with. My most recent good memory of WoW's community is actually when Classic launched. It really felt like the game I used to love in every respect, but largely due to the community of people playing at the time. In my experience with it, most people were friendly, helpful and chatty in one way or another, and you'd end up seeing the same people time and time again as you leveled through the zones, and it was a nice experience to be able to whisper them and say, "Hi buddy, how you doing? We ran Dead Mice together last week." I'm so sad, even to this day, that Classic has ended up dying off a lot. I still truly believe it happened in large part due to the implementation of an in-game store by Blizzard, desperately trying to ruin a good thing for the sake of lining Bobby Kotick's pockets. I don't want to dwell on that too much, but in shorter terms, the WoW community has been getting gradually worse over the years in my experience, and it makes me a bit sad. On the complete opposite end of the spectrum, the Final Fantasy XIV community is an absolute delight. I wasn't sure at all what to expect when I first went into the game, and like a lot of WoW refugees, I was expecting it to be perhaps a little too nice, like a forced, sickly sweet and passive-aggressive community of people. It is not at all anything like that in my experience. I can literally count on one hand the number of times I've had unpleasant dealings with a random person in pub groups. Most people I encounter are either silent, and therefore no trouble, or polite and friendly and even up for a little chat, something I was immensely surprised by with the community's opinions of Sprouts. When I was a newbie and trying to work out how things worked in the game, my first port of call was to ask my best friend, as she got me into the game and knows pretty much everything there is to know about it. However, if she wasn't around at the time, I knew I could always walk up to anyone I saw in a city and ask them for help, and if they were able, they would. The one part of the FF14 community I don't know much about is free companies. I've been a part of a couple throughout my time playing, but never stayed in one for more than a week. I didn't have any problems with them or anything, it just seemed a little pointless for what I was looking for from the game. I'd join a guild in WoW to play more difficult content and not have to stress about dealing with pugs when doing my dailies, but I've largely stopped playing the high levels of content in FF14, and I find the vast majority of pugs to be very nice to play alongside. Aside from the community actually within the game itself, they also do a lot of stuff outside of the game. The first and most relevant thing that comes to mind as I'm writing this is the 1400 singer strong fan cover of Close in the Distance put together by Alex Mukala. Do not watch that if you haven't finished the MSQ because it has spoilers. It genuinely gave me chills and made me tear up the first couple of times I watched and listened to it. In short, the FF14 community is a huge draw to the game for many people, and for those that it isn't, it's surely a nice bonus. In-game purchases. This one is definitely a large point of contention. I won't be starting with WoW and leading into FF in this. I'll just be going over it briefly on what my opinion is of why I think they differ between the two games. Both stores have a large number of cosmetic items. I'll be saying straight away off the bat, I could not care less about those. Cosmetic is completely unimportant. I've bought a handful of cosmetic items from a few different games I've played because I wanted them, and I didn't begrudge people who didn't buy them or those who bought more than me. The main thing I think there's a large difference with are the quote-unquote pay-to-win features. I have bought some of these in both games. I've boosted a few characters in WoW over the years, and I've boosted a few jobs in FF during my time playing. Despite wishing they weren't even a part of the game, my thoughts on both are as follows. I do not at all regret my purchases of WoW boosts. It would have been an annoying slog to level those characters up all the way, and I can't be bothered with it after the first time I've done it. I absolutely regret my purchases of the job boosts in FF14. All I did was pay money to skip through actual story content, and I wish wholeheartedly that I didn't do it. The boosts in WoW are only there to completely eradicate a process that Blizzard have been trying time and time again to speed up for players. Simply forcing people through old content as fast as they can, telling them not to look or worry about it, and rush them towards the shiny new content instead. The boosts in FF are there as an option for players who don't care about the story and just want to play something different. And that's fine, that's an entirely valid way to play the game, but I don't think I'm wrong in assuming that the vast majority of the community care a lot about the amazing stories in this game. And those who do care, myself included, don't get anything special out of buying job or MSQ boost. If anything, we miss out. To summarise, the boosts in WoW are indicative of a larger problem, that being that the older content is forcibly made completely irrelevant by Blizzard each time a new expansion launches. And the boosts in FF are, in my opinion, and I'm sure many other people's too, actually only of any value to a niche portion of the community and therefore not a major issue. Conclusion. Both of these games hold a very special place in my heart. I've been playing WoW for such a long time. There's always something so immensely comforting about being able to just get back into the swing of it and enjoy the game the same way I always have throughout my life. And while I haven't been playing FF14 for nearly as long, it has quickly built itself up to the same height as WoW in my heart. And, you probably guessed it, even surpassed it. I don't want anyone watching this video to think that I hate World of Warcraft. I love World of Warcraft, and that's why I'm so disappointed in it. As for the future of both games, I hope WoW makes some changes and becomes a game that I can enjoy once again, and I hope that FF14 continues to be excellent in the years to come. Thank you for watching that video. I'm sort of doing an unscripted conclusion to this, because as I was writing this script and recording the video and collecting footage and whatnot for it, the video sort of took on new meaning for me in a weird way. And I understand that it's just a video comparing two games, but when you've spent literally years of your life playing these sort of games, they'd sort of become a part of your life in a weird way. And I'm sure you might have noticed that throughout the video I reference my best friend. Unfortunately, just as I was starting to get this video wrapped up, I won't go into detail, something happened and we no longer talk. And it sucks, and I miss that person very much. The reason this video took on new meaning is because of this friend. Because now, when I play these games without them, there's a pang of pain and loss. There's a feeling of something missing. But there's also a lot of good memories. There's also a lot of positives. And I think I'm going to try and focus on that when I play these games. These games mean more to me than just the face value of the story, the graphics, the company, anything about it. The games have more meaning than that. These games represent good times I spent with someone who was very important to me. And I'm going to try to focus on that rather than the fact that they aren't there anymore. Thanks for watching.